in that door and see who's playing that organ. Because I loved an organ. I got up there and peeped in the door, but first I listened. And somebody was playing that organ and they was singing. And I peeped around and it was a man playing the organ, and he was playing the song, Jesus, Lover of My Soul. And I stood there and listened. And the longer I listened, the more that really touched me. And I began to cry. And I began to realize that I really was a special person, that God really did love me, and that Jesus did really love me. And I stood there and cried a little bit, and the man never knew I was there. And I ran down the steps then finally and ran home, and I thought, oh, Mom and Dad's going to be worried about me because all the kids are so far ahead of me, and they're going to be coming looking for me. But on the way running home, I knew that Jesus had come to me. And I just said, oh, Jesus, I'm going to serve you all the days of my life. I made him that promise, and when the Lord and me made a covenant that day. And I wondered how I was going to tell my parents. When I got home, everything was okay, but I couldn't tell them. Because I had heard them say, I had heard my mom say, and a lot of the older people said, well, a child going forth in the church in a revival meeting, they don't really know what they're doing until they're at least 12 years old. And I was young. I was only 8. And I thought, well, if I tell them, they're not going to believe anything's happened to me, but I know it did. And so I said, well, I'll have to wait until I'm 12 to tell them. Well, when I went back to church on Sunday, I realized that Sunday a revival was beginning there. And that's why that man had come. And his name was Preacher Newton from Hinton. He'd come there to have a revival in that Baptist church. Sunday morning I went to Sunday school and to church, and when he preached, every service that I went to when he preached, I'd sit there in that pew in the invitation time and just weep. And the preacher would come and talk to me, and the people would come and talk to me, but I couldn't tell them why I was crying. I knew I was supposed to go forward, but I couldn't go forward because everybody believed that anybody under 12 years old didn't know what they were doing. So I was satisfied within my heart, but I knew that my name should be on the church roll and I should get baptized. So I drifted on, knowing that I was saved and always at church, and always being persecuted by my cousins and the rest of my family because they saw something different in me that they didn't like. And I began to have a hard time. Kids can pick up on that. It is really hard when they can see a change in you and you know why they're persecuting you. And so they'd push me off the walk in the mud. I'd go home with my shoes all muddy and in a bad shape, and finally my dad said, this has got to stop. I don't know why they're doing this to you, but this has got to stop. And he was the town cop. He said, don't say a word to them, I'll take care of it. But I was a nervous wreck every evening when I'd get out of school because I knew they was going to tackle me on the way home. But one evening, as they started on me, he just stepped out of the woods with his uniform on. He didn't say a word. He just stepped out of the woods and stood there. And when they saw him, they knew him. And brother, did they take off home. And they never knew when he did that a couple times. And after that, they never knew when he was going to step out of the woods, and they started leaving me alone. And I began to have a better life. But I never was baptized until I was 15 years old. And finally I decided, well, I have known all along what I was doing, and so I decided I was going to be baptized. And so that is the way my young life started off. And it did kind of mold me into I believe it began to mold me in a young age to who I am really today.
What was it like living back then?
Hmm?
What was it like living back then? What were the living conditions
Well,
like?
the living conditions were, no one went to the store and bought a loaf of sliced bread then. You didn't go to the grocery store and get groceries in a paper bag or a plastic bag like we did then. When they went to the grocery store, they took a pillowcase or a feed bag or something and got the groceries in it. If the store was far away, which it was from us back there then, when we lived up in Fisher Creek Hollow, Dad would go to the store on a horse. He would take a chicken or some eggs or something and trade it for groceries, for coffee and sugar and baking powder. They raised their own food, raised a garden and raised their own food. They had their own chickens and eggs, and he would raise some beef, and he'd always raise hogs, have his ham, make sausage, make lard. And so you didn't buy very much out of the store. So they put the groceries in, they usually have two of them, two pillowcases or two sacks. Put some in each end and tie them together and lay them across the back of the saddle to deliver their groceries home and go home on a horse, go to the grocery store on a horse. And when we went to church, my dad, we had a sled. We had a team of horses, gray horses. One of them's name was Dan and the other one was George. And we had a riding horse too, just used for riding. But when we'd go to church, he would hook one of those gray horses up to a sled. And he'd put straw in the sled. We'd get all dressed up with our Sunday clothes on and our long skirts and bonnets and get in the sleds. And he would take us to church in that sled. And what we would do, we'd get there by about 10:30 or 11 o'clock. We'd have service. And everybody packed their lunch and took it. And we'd have our dinner spread. If it was bad weather, we'd have it in the church somewhere. If it wasn't, we called it dinner on the ground. And then we'd have a service in the afternoon, and then everybody'd go home. We never went home between services there then. But it was odd what happened to one of the horses. After we had moved from Fisher Creek Hollow to Meadow Bridge, where I was going to school, we moved in between Otto dying and me becoming 8 years old to start to a new school. We had moved 7 miles from Fisher Creek Hollow to Meadow Bridge. We had moved 7 miles, and that was a lumber town. Years before that, there were big sawmills set up there. And houses built around there for the people who worked in the woods and cut the trees and sawed the lumber. My dad always worked on the sawmill, cutting the lumber. That's what he did. So we went out there to live in one of those houses. The sawmills were gone from there then, and it just became a little country town. Those houses were there. Well, we had moved out there, and he still had that team of horses. And it became Memorial Day, the 30th of May. Everybody always went to the cemetery to put flowers on the graves. And my grandparents on my mother's side had already passed away. And so we